Conservation is an essential part of our culture. It is what we basically have as the base of ensuring sustainability of our resources, both in the ocean and on the land.
There are a lot of challenges that we're facing. We need the science to help support the management, that we cannot just say we're going to close an area and then not look at it, because there might be other issues that we don't know about that are affecting the area.
When it comes to planning the future, they need a bit more data. That data is in all the remote places, which is where we fit in.
Using all these different tools, from very simplistic to very sophisticated, we can paint a picture of the entire ecosystem and kind of tell the story of how the whole ecosystem functions. Local communities manage their resources much better. They're out on the reef every single day, and they're also the eyes on the water every day. And these are the people who have the most to gain, but also the most to lose by ineffective management and poor resource health.
Creo que somos un ejemplo como comunidad ante la pesquería que hacemos, que tiene más de 100 años de antigüedad. Nosotros apuntamos para hacer un turismo sostenible. Más o menos eso es como el objetivo general de nuestra agrupación como gremio.
Este es un pueblo de menos de 1000 personas que vive principalmente de la pesca de la langosta y también del turismo. Y eso me impresiona, me agrada y creo que es ejemplar. Y ojalá todas las comunidades del mundo que se dedican a la pesca y al turismo también pensaran igual.
The opportunity that conservation brings has been our livelihood, both for food security as well as to generate incomes for families locally.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 8th event in the You and the Planet series. It's so brilliant to be here, and for this event tonight the Royal Society have teamed up with the global non-profit, the National Geographic Society, who of course his mission is to use the power of science and exploration and education to really illuminate stories about our planet, about nature and about our world. And of course, as part of that mission, the National Geographic Society of course has a long history of exploring the mysteries of our ocean, conserving wildlife, conserving our precious marine ecosystems, and of course expanding the number of marine sanctuaries across the globe, including one of the signature projects, Pristine Seas, that you just saw a clip of then. It's led by National Geographic Explorer in residence Enrique Sala, and he showed us exactly a bit more about their work and how they work with local communities to protect critical marine ecosystems. And of course, tonight's event is focusing on our planet's oceans and the opportunities and the challenges that we face to have a more sustainable, a healthier and just better, cleaner relationship with our oceans. That clip does exactly that and shows us how the National Geographic Society work to explore and protect our oceans. And of course, another way they do that is with National Geographic Explorers. And of course, they're scientists and storytellers and filmmakers and conservationists who, again, are carrying out this critical work for our precious marine environments. In fact, if you're interested in learning more about some of the work they do covering these marine related issues, you can go to natgeo.com/oceans. And we are lucky to have two of those National Geographic Explorers with us on our brilliant panel today, as well as other fantastic experts who are experts in their own field, in oceanography work and marine work as well. They're really at the forefront of what they do, and we'll hear from them in just a moment. But before we do, I just want to say a massive thank you to all of you who have already submitted your questions to the panel in advance. I'm hoping to get to a few of them tonight in tonight's discussion. We actually have live captioning available this evening as well. So if you'd like to see these, just click the subtitles / closed captions button in the bottom bar. And if you haven't submitted questions already, but you'd like to, you can do just that. So what I've got here is the Slido app. So slido.com. If you head to that website, that app, you can download it, use the code Y294. It looks a little bit like this. And just on there, we've got a Q&A running and a poll section running as well. Once you type in that code, it's Y294. It'll ask you to type in your first name. That's all you have to do, first name, log in, and then we can start chatting away and getting conversation going between you guys. It's a really interactive kind of plus of having this brilliant discussion here today. And we want to hear from you. So get your questions in. We'll be having polls throughout today's talk. So get in touch. If you do a tweet or put out anything on socials, use the hashtag #YouAndThePlanet so we do not miss it. And I think it's time we should meet our fantastic panelists. So just to introduce myself, my name is Lizzie Daly. I'm an animal movement scientist, broadcaster and wildlife TV presenter, and I love all things marine. I should have been born a shark, but here we go, you can't win it all. But I'm not a marine biologist. In fact, I'm not a marine expert, but we have a brilliant panel here today to tell us more about what they do. We're going to start with you, Diva. Amon, lovely to have you here. Tell us more about who you are and your background.
Thanks, Lizzie. Delighted to be here. So I'm a marine biologist focused on the little known habitats and animals of the deep ocean, as well as how our actions are impacting them. And I've found myself weirdly at this nexus of like science, policy, and communication, and have an increasingly deep desire to see stewardship measures applied to the deep ocean, as well as the engagement of a broader group of stakeholders towards that effort.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you so much. Jahawi Bertolli, hello, nice to see you here again. Yeah, tell us more about your background.
So I'm a wildlife cameraman and filmmaker, but my passion is the ocean. I had the privilege of growing up on the Kenyan coastline, but I've also seen the changes that are happening. So currently my focus is actually on trying to tell stories about the changes of the ocean, but told through the eyes of communities on the coastline, local communities that are living through it, and to try and get communities on board and educated to be able to champion conservation for their marine environments.
Brilliant stuff. And I'd love to delve into that in a bit more detail as we have some of the questions that have already been sent in. So thank you. Lovely to see you here. Richard Thompson, hello. Tell us more about kind of what you do.
So I'm a marine biologist by training, but I spent actually most of the last 30 years looking at plastic in the ocean. And that fascinated me early in my career because I found that the shores I was studying and the experiments that I got set up there, that litter was accumulating in them every day. And I started to get fascinated by it, counting it, recording it, trying to figure out where it had come from. And I made this by chance observation that we weren't studying the small stuff. And that led in 2004, we published the first paper to use the term microplastic. And since then, we've been looking at, impacts, distribution, but increasingly, what can we do about it? What can we do to stop the challenge that plastic presents in the oceans?
Fantastic stuff. And last but not least, Angela Hatton joins us as well. Hi, Angela.
Nice to be here. So I'm Angela, I'm the Director of Science and Technology at the National Oceanography Centre. My background was actually as a biologist, and then I became a seagoing oceanographer. But now my job is to oversee a whole range of things, from the technology we develop to the observations we take to the understanding of the oceans as a whole. And so my job is now to enable a bunch of very, very excellent scientists to do what they do really, really well.
No small job. for any of our
Not easy.
wonderful panelists today. Absolutely fantastic. Thanks, Angela. Okay, so a whole range of questions have been submitted today, so I'd really like to get stuck in, but before I do, I guess just a general setting up question, and this is where I'd like to get you audience watching involved, as I can see you are already sending in some brilliant questions and points, so thank you so much for that. I'm going to start by asking, what do you think are the biggest threats to our oceans? And if you go on that app, I'll say it again, it's Slido, SLIDO.com, enter the code Y294, and head on to the Q&A. You will see, hopefully, the question, what do you think are the biggest threats to our oceans? Please put in kind of words that you think would be relevant to that big question, and we'll be coming back to that at the end after we ask the panelists to look at a bit of a word cloud. So while you guys do that, I'm going to turn that question to our wonderful panelists. Richard, I'd love to start with you, because you mentioned your work, of course, with microplastics, which has transformed our understanding, or I guess acceptance in the public eye of actually the importance of ridding of microplastics. But for you, is that one of the world's and our ocean's biggest problems?
It's certainly a major challenge, but there are lots of challenges that face the oceans, and I think it's not really appropriate to try and separate them in some sort of ranking and therefore reach a conclusion that we should only focus on A or B, whatever that might be. The only way that we can really safeguard the oceans is to work across a number of different channels that threaten the ocean simultaneously, and many of these things have synergies between them. You know, there are synergies between the way that we produce, design, use plastics and climate change, for example. There are clear links between habitat destruction and biodiversity. There are links between plastics and biodiversity. So many of these things are interconnected, and it sometimes worries me when we try to kind of call them off and say, you know, what are the top 5 that we absolutely need to focus on?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not kind of a small kind of easily digestible issue, is it? There's kind of lots of different areas and variability within that to look at. Diva, you mentioned at the beginning in your intro how you obviously carry out really great work to celebrate the uncelebrated, perhaps those species that don't get the limelight, like our humpback whales and our sharks. So for you, kind of what is the main threat to some of the I guess lesser loved species? Or yeah.
I mean, definitely what Richard said is absolutely true, especially, you know, when you think about all of those impacts, basically having synergistic effects on each other, having cumulative impacts on each other. But I think, you know, in the deep ocean, of course, we see the litter that eventually breaks down into microplastics. We see litter of debris of all different kinds. But there are other issues like deep ocean fishing, bottom trawling, that has huge impacts in the deep ocean. And also, of course, there's the increasing effects of the climate crisis having an impact on the deep ocean. But of course, these places that are, you know, far from our sight, it's much harder to see and understand those impacts.
Angela, you have kind of traveled the world and been on many ocean expeditions throughout your career. How about you?
So for me, the baseline has to be climate change. I think it's so fundamental to so many of the changes that are happening. And the oceans play a really significant role in climate. They've taken up about 93% of the excess heat we've generated and about 30% of the carbon, anthropogenic carbon. And that's kind of changed the ocean both physically and chemically. And so the warming in the ocean, extreme heat events, they're causing everything from damage to coral reefs to polar systems. And actually things like sea level, it doesn't just affect us, it's actually affecting the organisms in the ocean as well, particularly those in benthic and coastal environments. But for me, one of the other things is that it creates multi-pressures. And so the warming in the ocean is then combined with changing carbon in the ocean, which is affecting the pH, which is combined with the way in which oxygen is being distributed in the ocean and available. Those combination of things puts real pressure on systems that might cope with a little bit of change, but when you keep throwing different things at it. But because climate change is affecting every part of the ocean, no matter where you are, I think for me, that's got to be one of the key ones. However, completely agree with everyone else that the complexity of the ocean is what I love, and everything is connected, is one ocean, completely connected. And so we can't really say there's one thing without addressing all things.
Yeah, very well said. And of course, Jahawi, your job is to try and find those narratives in this massive range of issues and tell that story and connect with people. And as you say, build up those relationships with communities who live in these environments. So for you, what would be the kind of go-to threat or issue for you?
It's one of those things where it's really difficult to say because, as everyone said, we have the threat of climate change on a global level. We have fishing, unregulated commercial fishing that's becoming a big issue off the East African coast, which is affecting local communities here. And it's trying to juggle what to tackle first. Now, from our standpoint, is to try and get local understand the bigger issues at hand, so that when we're talking about regulations in terms of fisheries, people on the ground know what's happening, so they can push for conservation in terms of what they wanted to be able to sustain their livelihoods. But it is difficult because, we're in the process of trying to set up a new marine protected area, and we've been going great. And then all of a sudden we've had massive bleaching events. So, there's so many things kind of being thrown at us now that it's quite difficult. But I think the minute you have communities understanding their ocean and us understanding their view of conserving their ocean, we can start doing smaller changes that hopefully will impact a much greater environment.
Yeah, and those kind of incremental changes are so valuable in ultimately that global bigger picture. So yeah, very, very well put. Okay, well, great way to start, I think. I'm also now going to throw you all in the midst of our first poll. Dun, 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 dun. And I'm sure all the panelists will know the answer to this question. But the first poll of today is, what percent of the ocean has been mapped? Is it 10 to 15%, 35 to 40%, 50 to 55%, or 100%? Can you imagine? So that's just gone up on here, and I'm sure our panelists know the answers. You'll see it kind of up there. Vote away, please, and we'll start getting some of your questions on. You've been kind of very active on here, and wow, there's a lot of questions. If we don't mind, Jahawi, I'll come to you on this one, because Emily asked just about coastal communities, and she has asked, how can we best balance the needs of local coastal communities with the need for conservation?
That's a great question, because often with the way we've sort of approached things, is we forget that coastal communities have been appropriately managing their environments for a long time. And changes in the environment, changes in technology, and all these new things are coming through that it's kind of out of whack. And a lot of the times when we sort of go in to try and work with coastal communities, you forget that there's a wealth of cultural knowledge there. And if you're going to approach communities to try and create, better fisheries, this, that, the other, you need to honor the fact that there's knowledge that they have. And that, it has to be a balance between what we know currently instead of modern knowledge and cultural knowledge, and how do you amalgamate that into the best kind of way forward, because it has to be both sides. And with what we've been seeing, these communities know they used to have sort of, we fished here and we didn't fish here. This was a breeding ground, this wasn't. Now, fish are a lot harder to find, and the current generation that's coming up are losing that ancient knowledge. But so in terms of that, the knowledge is there, we just need to get it back, and we need to foster that knowledge with the communities coming. And then from a legislative point of view, county governments, big governments, we need to understand that there is knowledge here, and it has to be two ways. Because all of a sudden you have, the government comes and says you can't, or you can, or you can't, without referencing local knowledge. And all of a sudden you've alienated part of your solution. And I think it's incredibly important that we value local knowledge and use it as part of, the story that we're looking at.
Yeah, fantastic stuff. I'm going to put the next question to you, Angela, if I may. This is from William K. Hi, William. And he says, what does the panel think is the best thing that members of the public can do as individuals to help protect our oceans?
Well, it's a very good question. I think it's not one thing. So I actually think it's people who can make a massive difference in this way. So the choices you make every day can make a huge difference. One of the biggest issues in the ocean is solved on land, and solved by the way we think about what we consume, the way we think about the waste that we generate. the way in which we actually support or influence our governments. You know, we can drive change, and we can have cultural change that makes a huge difference. So if each one of us does a bit, rather than thinking somebody needs to fix it, we can make a huge difference. So it's the little things in your life every day that you shouldn't even need to worry about, whether you recycle, whether you think about where your food is generated, whether you support sustainable development activities. You can do an awful lot. And on a small scale, you can get involved with beach cleaning, you can get involved with activities that are actually about promoting health of the ocean. So I think there's so much rather than one thing, but I would say if you were starting, think about your choices you're making every day and whether they're sustainable.
Great advice. And of course, in the plastic conversation, Richard, this is equally as important as a consumer, right? Oh, Richard, sorry, you're muted. One of us had to do it. Thank you for taking one for the team.
It's all right. The host muted me actually, and I assumed the host would unmute me, but he didn't. So yeah, I think what Angela said spot on. It is about things that we do on land, and actually, you know, a lot of the key science we need to help the oceans is science that's based on land. It's science about the choices that we each make, and also how we produce and use things so that we can do that in a way that is more sustainable in an ocean context. So it's the absolutely key going forward is thinking about the planet as a system, and the land and the sea are part of that. And we can't think about the science of the sea in isolation and hope that that will bring the answers. We need science on land and on sea, and we need to connect people. And I also echo what Jahawi said, you know, those cultural connections of managing the oceans that we had, it worries me that in many, many places we've lost them. And I see statistics from communities that live within a few kilometers of the coast, and yet many of the individuals there haven't visited the coast in years. And that's part of the tragedy, that, you know, we buy fish from a supermarket and don't think about where it's come from. So it's about connecting the land and the sea and collecting communities to the oceans in each of their decisions on a daily basis. That's going to be fundamental to tackling this, as well as the science to underpin it.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Diva, if I may kind of ask you the same question, if there's somebody listening on here who wants to make a change, what would be your top tips for them?
So I'd say two things. And of course, you know, everything that has been said before, absolutely. But two further things would be, especially with the deep ocean, or just the ocean in general, just talk about it. You know, just tell stories about it, educate someone else, your friend, your family, your neighbor, whatever, about something about the ocean, whether it is something incredible about it or a threat that it's facing. That's, I think, one of the biggest steps, as well as, you know, I think often, yes, of course, we absolutely need that bottom up movement to create change, but we also need top down. And often I think the political will is missing. And there is a big disconnect between, for instance, the grassroots organizations, the community-based organizations that Jahawi and others are referring to, with their practices and the, you know, the issues that are being faced there, and what, for instance, governments, whether it is in the same country or globally, whatever, that are really, there's a disconnect between them. And it's about sort of repairing that. And I think that the average citizen can help to like lobby for those changes, can help to push the government in directions that they themselves would like to see things go.
Brilliant advice. And it's kind of gives you a bit of hope, I think, is a small part of a massive problem. You know, we have the power, as much as we have seen the negative impacts of the planet, we have the power to completely change that. So that's absolutely brilliant. We have got lots of questions coming in. So I'm going to fire this one off to you, Richard, if I may. What can we do to stop ocean plastic pollution at the source?
Yeah, I mean, that's key. And to me, the challenge here is making sure that we do a much better job of using plastics responsibly. It's not plastic per se that's the problem. The litter in our oceans is a symptom of inefficient and inadequate use. You know, plastics can actually help to reduce our footprint on the planet. So the answer is about using them more responsibly. You think of uses that can help reduce food wastage in packaging. You think of lightweight parts in cars and aeroplanes, reduce carbon emissions. All of those things can be achieved without the need for this emission to the ocean. So the challenge is to design plastics in a more responsible manner so they can deliver a life in service And I'd absolutely say that it is about the things we've known for decades, and that's what frustrates me. It is about reduce, reuse, recycle. Reduce is going to be key if we don't need the plastic item in the first place. And there are some instances of that. But then it gets more challenging because there are definitely examples, as I've just indicated, where plastics are the best material for the job. And in those instances, we either need to design for increased reuse or we need to design for greater circularity via recycling. And yeah, it's a frustration to me. If I were to take a group of recyclers into a supermarket and show them the products there, they'd scratch their heads, and it'd be a very small number of them that they'd say they could actually recycle over and over again, to get the carbon really going around in a circular economy. And, there are many examples, we haven't got time to look at them now, where actually frustratingly, a little bit more thought at the design stage could have made a product that was much more circular. And so that's part of the challenge, I think, is making sure we're designing plastics with end of life in mind, as well as life in service in mind. And yet that's what we haven't done. We've designed plastics to be throwaway. And that's the pedigree that's resulted in the littering, that we design them to be valueless, disposable items that bring us convenience, and we can chuck them away without a care. And that's what's resulting largely with the escape of plastics as litter to the environment and to the oceans. That's what's got to change.
Brilliant. Thanks, Richard. We've got a question from Mr. Amaduri, who said, what are the solutions for saving our planet post-COVID? Of course, this past year has been unprecedented on so many different levels. Angela, if it's okay to come to you with this, because I'm sure it's impacted our oceans, communities, the very fundamentals of all of our lives sat on here. What do you think we need to do moving forward out of this pandemic?
I think with the pandemic, there's a lot of things we've actually learned, which is that we can work in a way that's more virtual. We don't need to travel as much, and we can still communicate. I would advocate that many of us still want to get back to some of the ways in which we'd like to meet people and spend time with others. But I think we've actually learned that our perception of how we needed to be is that we can adapt and we can change. And I think if we can take that feeling of what we've learned about how we can adjust our behavior and change and incorporate that into our everyday life going forward, that would be better. To be honest, the COVID situation is such a huge thing over the whole world that we just need to think about that as an important priority as well right now. And we need to actually understand that the implications for individual people is huge. So I don't take away from that, but if we can learn a little bit from what we've been doing, I think we'll be doing a much better place in the future.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Jahawi, I'll come to you for this one. This is from Tim. What's the most amazing thing you've seen in the ocean?
That's such a hard question. What's amazing in the ocean? I mean, it's a place that we often feel so disconnected with, but once you start spending time in it, and for me, it was for example, I made friends with a triggerfish. And on days, it was my best friend. On days, it attacked me. I still have bite marks in my fins from when he was on a bad day. But it's the realization that it's a complete incredible world with characters that are characters and go about their daily lives and are doing things much as what's going on land. And it's not like this forgotten place where, if the things we were doing on land happen in the ocean, we'd be in complete uproar about it. But because it's hard for people to get to the ocean, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And from being humbled by swimming with, a blue whale or a humpback, it puts you in your place as a human. You realize just, how small you are, and you are part of that ecosystem. We're part of the world. We're a tiny part of the world, but we're creating a massive impact. And we kind of all need to be pushed back to that size to realize, we're affecting the one planet we have. And for me, that's what the ocean does, is it puts you back in that place of, wow, this is a massive, incredible world. And we need to think about it because it's our only home.
Yeah, gosh, it's nothing more humbling than being in the ocean and, you know, seeing even a triggerfish fly by in the ocean. It's just yeah, an experience like no other. So thank you for sharing that story. Just to let you all know, on the Slido app, there is currently the next poll which is running. So for our panelists, especially for you, Richard, do you think that single-use plastics should be banned? The answers are yes, I don't know, or no. I've got 79% on yes. Discuss.
Would you like me to comment on that now?
I would actually. I think you should. Or anyone.
Well, my view is no, we shouldn't ban all single-use plastics. What we need to do is to use them more appropriately than we have done. And you know, the single use is often picked out, but you think of packaging, and that's often picked on, but it can very much extend the life of food and drink in our shops and reduce food wastage, which is another major environmental challenge. You think about all of the fish harvested from the sea. If we can't protect that from perishing, we're going to waste a lot of it. And some of that is going to have to be single-use packaging. Now, the trick here is in not making the packaging so single-use. And that doesn't mean we all have to take a Tupperware tub to be refilled, although we could do that. It could be reused via a circular economy by designing packaging that can be much more compatible, much more widely compatible with recycling. So, and then to me, it kind of ceases to become single use in a way. So I think it's about changing and transforming the way we use plastic. But the answer isn't, to me, in banning plastic packaging from our supermarkets and having a plastic-free aisle, because I think we'd see much more food perishing.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure lots of people think, I mean, it's the go-to, isn't it? You hear it everywhere. Reduce single-use plastic, stop single-use plastic. So yeah,
we need to reduce it. Yeah, but I wouldn't say it's about eliminating it. It is not that simple, unfortunately.
And I was going to ask Richard, I mean, surely there are medical implications, I mean, medical uses of single-use plastic as well that are absolutely essential.
I just picked on the food use, but absolutely in medical use. But it's about designing for end of life. So in many medical applications, it's highly likely that the plastic will be incinerated, the single-use plastic, the gloves, the scalpels, any of that. So we need to make sure that we're designing that plastic possibly for incineration. I don't think that's the answer to everyday plastics that we might buy in a supermarket as packaging. I think there's a much better end of life, but in some instances it will be incineration. And there we need to design the plastic products with that in mind so that we can release the energy from them in a way that won't also simultaneously release lots of very challenging gaseous chemicals. And so it's about designing with end of life in mind. And it really frustrates me when I talk to the product designers. They say, gosh, that was never in the brief. We were asked to make plastic products that looked attractive and that functioned while they were in use, no matter how short-lived the use. And that's the tragedy of it all. Yeah, really complex. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for answering that. I'm sure lots of people are sat on the poll thinking, oh, okay, well, maybe rethinking their answers there. A question from Ruby Booth. I'll come to you if it's all right, Diva. How did members of the panel get into the marine sector? University degree, internships, and what advice would you give to young marine biologists trying to break through? Diva, I'll come to you first, if I may.
Okay, so like Jahawi, didn't grow up in the UK. I grew up in Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, and so, you know, islands surrounded by water, it was kind of natural. But it wasn't until I went to university that was when I really learned about the deep ocean and the fact that there was this entirely, like, the largest ecosystem on the planet, nearly completely unexplored, so much work to be done. And that was really that pivotal moment for me. But I think, you know, in terms of advice, I would say that it's an amazing career and we need more of them. And that's just because of the general health of the planet, the general health of the ocean. We need more people working to try to understand how the ocean works, what lives in it, and how best we can manage and protect it, as well as in doing that in an inclusive and equitable way.
Fantastic stuff. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, the questions are flying in. This is so brilliant to see. Thank you all so much for sending them in. Before I move on to the next question, we have another poll, and we've touched on this briefly already in terms of responsibility and where does that lie. But the poll is, who do you think should be primarily responsible for restoring ocean health and ensuring future sustainability? Is it individuals, communities, business and industry, government and policymakers, everyone, none of the above, or I don't know. So any one of those, you can have a look on the poll on the app. I remind you all, it's slido.com and it's Y294 is the code if you haven't already. So that's now live. Why don't I pose that question to any of the panelists who want to take that? I feel like it's a really big one, but you've all kind of touched on various aspects of that. Who would be your go-to in terms of responsibility?
I'm happy to start on that one, which is, I think, the first of all, I think ultimately world governments are responsible, but they are part of the whole system with us as well. But it's really important that it's kind of managed internationally. So it needs to be managed internationally through conventions. And we do have some things in place, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, and we have that does a huge amount in terms of determining how we might manage the oceans. Governments themselves need to manage their own economic zones, but in terms of thinking about the 60% of the planet, which is, or plus, which is open ocean, deep sea water, that has no regulation formally, then the governments need to work together internationally in order to make that happen. My feeling is governments respond to people, and therefore, unless we work on it, we won't change that. And so again, I'm going to say it's never one thing, it's always a combination of things. And I think ultimately governments can put in the right policy, the right procedures, the right way of monitoring. They can actually regulate and determine how we can do things, and they can have penalties. But unless we help determine what needs to be done, then we won't be able to do that. And underlying that is always going to be research. We don't know enough about the oceans. And so if we're going to really determine how to manage them, we need to be able to observe them. We need to see how it's changing. And if you take that at the moment, the definition is about only 90% of the organisms living in the ocean have not even been described properly. And we don't know enough. 96% of the habitable space on Earth for living organisms is in the ocean, 4 kilometers deep compared to the surface of the land. And yet we know very little about it. So if we're really going to do that, then there's a whole responsibility for scientists to actually get the evidence and the information that's needed. So I gave you
yeah, you did actually, but kind of going back to that first poll that we did, it was 10 to 15% of our oceans have been mapped. 10 to 15%. Like you say, there's so much we really don't know. And 62% of those actually on the app currently say it's 63 now, say it's everyone's responsibility, and 31% then say government and policy makers. So I think there's bit of everything in there. And Jahawi, I mean, for you, it's like you make a really powerful story and documentary, and I'm sure that influences and goes on to inspire lots of people as consumers to kind of and to decide how they eat, how they shop, what decisions they may make. So for you, where does the responsibility lie?
You know, going on for what Angela said, which is completely true, but we need to make information readily accessible on all grounds and to a lot of people. So that means scientists talking to government, government talking to scientists, and then also everyone else, so that we can make informed decisions. And so without the might of people behind you, people can influence government. And if information that's coming from science is made available, and often it's not, it's these scientific journals and this and that, and it's not given in a way for the general population to understand, how can they push for something if they don't understand what's going on? So it's so important that this information is disseminated in a way that is understandable on all grounds, because it's everyone's responsibility, and we need to be able to be given the right information for us to make up our own minds and to understand what's going on, so that we can push the government. That's the wrong way. So yeah. I think it's all of us, and all that information needs to be given in a way that everyone understands, so everyone understands what we could lose.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why a panel like this is just so brilliant, because you all come with your own expertise and areas of backgrounds, and kind of having that like intersectional approach to making that change is so important. Diva, for you, what would be the golden nugget?
I mean, there's so many things that have been said already. Yes. Translation absolutely is essential. As scientists, we need to help our science to inform policy decisions and political agendas. And I want to emphasize inform rather than, we don't want it to lead to science washing, which is sometimes what happens politically. But I think, in terms of what Angela said, yes, absolutely. Most of our planet, the international waters or high seas, is more or less unregulated. And so what we're seeing is that there are lots of different siloed organizations. We have the International Seabed Authority, which is related to mineral activities. We have regional fishery management organizations, which are related, and none of them really talk to each other. And so there's sort of this like disconnected management. And so there is this process happening now at the United Nations called the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction negotiations. And it's thought to be wrapping up its initial negotiations this summer, hopefully. And that's meant to really rectify some of those key management issues and remove some of those silos so that we can manage in a more holistic way. And this is really important given that this area, international waters, a lot of what is found within it, especially minerals, is called the common heritage of mankind, or I prefer the common heritage of humankind. But that means it belongs to not just us on the call, not just everyone listening, but also to everyone on the planet and to everyone who's yet to come. And so really, we all have a stake and in this discussion. And I think, unfortunately, going back to what Jahawi was saying, I think local knowledge hasn't been present in these discussions. The cultural value of many of these places hasn't been brought into discussions. Indigenous perspectives haven't been brought into these discussions. And I think that's changing, but really we need to make more of an effort to have a much more inclusive and equitable conversation in these spaces.
Brilliant, brilliant. What great summary to that question. That's fantastic. And lots of people interacting with the poll there. So thank you all. Lots of conversations about plastic, Richard. So I'm coming back to you, if I may. Oh, anyone can comment on plastic. But Adam said only 9% of all plastics are actually recycled. How are we still talking about recycling as a solution to the plastic problem when the real issue is the exponentially growing production of plastics by fossil fuel companies and packaging manufacturers? How do we address the problem at the source? You've touched on this already, but please do go.
It is absolutely about reduce. We do need to drive down our usage, but as I've said already, there are many applications where plastics are probably the best material to do the job. You think of bringing you lemonade, we can't take it out the tap directly. I'm kind of against the idea that we should have bottled water when we've got it in our taps. But you think if you want to have lemonade and you want to have the freedom to do that, plastic bottles probably the best way to do it. The polymer that those bottles are typically made of is potentially highly recyclable. And yet I see many examples in the shops where it's not been designed for end-of-life recycling. So in answer to the question, you're right about the statistics. It is only about 10% of the current usage that gets recycled. But that isn't because recycling per se is a failure. It's because we failed to design the plastics in order that they could be recyclable at the end of their lifetime. And that's the biggest frustration. I mean, ironically, I've got an example here. There's no branding on it, don't worry. But that's a bottle made of a highly recyclable polymer that the recyclers don't want because some designers put a red pigment in it, and that's making it not unrecyclable. There's the same information to the consumer on it about the end of life, but it's going to reduce what the recyclers would say. It'll halve its value to them. So that makes it really challenging economically to recycle it as a consequence of something that's been added. It's not about protecting the drink. It's been added to achieve a marketing end. So we've got to design this stuff with end of life in mind. And so that's why I do actually hold a lot of hope for recycling. It isn't the only answer, but it clearly is part of the picture, but it'll only work if we design with that in mind.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Richard. Okay, we're going to power on through so many questions that are coming in. I'm going to open this up to any one of our panelists. It's from Lucy M, and she asks, what more could be done to encourage Scotland to focus on inland salmon farms in order to try and increase the number of wild salmon? And I guess this just goes to really all salmon farming or large-scale aquaculture fish farming. It's something that, for me personally, I'm very passionate about. There's a number of ecological issues and damages as a result of large-scale aquaculture and salmon farming that you see here in the UK. But does anyone want to kind of chime in on that and talk about, I guess, fisheries or salmon farmers in general? It's a bit of a specific question. Yeah.
I suppose I'm happy to kind of say a couple of things. I think, so if you think that aquaculture comes from a concept of trying to reduce the overfishing issues that may have been of the past. And so the idea being that if we actually could have aquaculture, we could reduce the impacts in the environment, and we could potentially reduce even the carbon effects from fishing. And over time, I think in 2016, aquaculture actually started to outgrow fisheries in terms of the main source of fish for human consumption. But then we shouldn't think of that as being something that doesn't have its own impacts. It's important. I mean, 20 million people are employed in aquaculture. It's an important source of food. If we're talking about net zero, marine protein is going to be a really important thing, because compared to what you can grow on land in terms of growing and farming animals, then we are much better off to be looking at fish from the sea. So we need to balance a number of things. And so, like everything, it's not just about whether you do it, it's how you do it.
Yes.
And so obviously, in lots of ways in which we do business, we can do it in a way that's quite damaging, that has an effect on the environment, that doesn't look after the welfare of animals. But we can do it other ways as well. And so I think we should, instead of assuming that aquaculture is just something we shouldn't do, I think we should be looking at how aquaculture should be done in a way that makes it sustainable. And there are lots of changes that have gone on. Even simple things like previously they threw a lot more fish feed in, which was very polluting underneath. And then they realized they could reduce the fish feed if they did it effectively. And that saved them money. So there's lots of things you can actually do. So for me, it's as much about how we do things. Can it be sustainable? Can we improve it? And what's the risk versus the benefit as part of that discussion?
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't like to oversimplify it to yes or no, but I do think it's something we need to do sustainably.
And Angela, if I can, because it's such a big industry, as you mentioned, it's so vital for livelihoods of coastal communities all over the world, from Chile to Norway to Scotland. But for such a large and growing industry, is this really something that we can still label with being sustainable? Of course, there's some brilliant technologies and brilliant advances in transforming it to be better. But really, are we going to be looking at this as a good kind of go-to for the future?
I think it's like all things, it's going to be, it's one of the things we're going to have to think about. And you have to remember, this is something that's happened for many years. And for lots of coastal communities, it was a very sensible way of actually maintaining and getting fish, which was safer. It was a way of actually being sure you could get food supplies. So again, I think like lots of things, the intensification of what we do, whether that's agriculture or aquaculture, or whether that's mining or thinking about oil and gas, the more intensified we are, the more we consume in a way that isn't needed, then that's when we hit the problems. So I think we need to kind of balance that. The balance is that we need to regulate, we need to make sure it's done properly, and we need to make sure we think about animal welfare as well. In terms of sustainability from an ocean point of view, actually not taking the stocks out of the ocean is a better option, if that makes sense. However, the downside of that, the fish in the aquaculture system are not experiencing the life in the ocean. So it's always about balance. So for a sustainability point of view, it's probably better than actually damaging the environment, particularly deep sea trawling. From a point of view of whether it's acceptable, then that's a very different question that maybe has to have a personal answer for many people.
Yeah, and we could do an hour on that, but we don't have time. So we're going to have another poll, and I'm trying to squeeze in a few more questions. This has been absolutely brilliant. The next poll is, what do you think are the top 3 things you can do to contribute to saving the seas? Consuming sustainably sourced seafood only, raising awareness of ocean-related issues, like through social media, reducing or not using single-use plastic products, reducing your energy use and power consumption, supporting ecotourism over traditional coastal tourism, participating in community-driven activities like beach cleanups or other. So if you're on Slido, please jump on to that poll, which is now live, and let us know what you think. I'll have a little scroll through at the end. But we've got so many questions. Diva, we had some questions coming in for you. How does Diva feel about, she's actually, Emma Fox, thank you so much for your question. She's fully named you, which I appreciate. How does Diva Amon feel about deep sea mining potentially occurring in the future?
Yeah, so that's, a really challenging question, but there are certainly some really big questions around sustainability and ethics, and especially from an environmental standpoint, a legal standpoint, a social standpoint, and even a rights-based standpoint. So I think there's a lot of unresolved issues around deep seabed mining. Just to start, it has not happened yet, but it is a growing issue in international waters and within national jurisdictions. And in fact, in international waters, over 1 million square kilometers globally have been set aside as deep sea exploration claims as a precursor to mining, if that does happen in the future. But certainly, given how little we know about the deep ocean, sure, we know more than we ever have, but it's still comparatively a little. And I worked as part of a team that was studying one of these areas where mining might happen in the future. And in 2013, when we went out, we were the first team to ever see the seafloor in that area and all of the habitats and animals that live there. And so this is really the level of knowledge that we are working with in many of these places. Like, we are just exploring them for the first time, just trying to catalog what is there for the first time. And that's much less, especially trying to understand. It's one thing knowing, another thing understanding and valuing somewhere. And so we're just not even close to that yet. So I think it would certainly be premature to think about rushing into the deep ocean to mine, especially because I think, given that it will likely be a very destructive practice, that it could result in, the loss of species, the loss of habitats, and the loss of functions and services that we and all of life on Earth relies on. So there's a lot at stake. And I think we just need some more time to gather science and increase the awareness of this issue so that we can make more informed decisions.
Yeah, well put. There we are. Answered perfectly. Thank you. Thank you, Diva. This is a question from Leah. What is the best way to translate discussion to action in terms of ocean biodiversity? Richard or Jahawi, would you like to take that one? Perhaps we'll start with you, Richard.
So I think, and it's a little bit like the poll, for me, I think the most important thing is, as a scientist that's probably coming towards the end of their career, is about communicating the complexity of trying to preserve the oceans for future generations. And so it's, to me, the most important thing I think I can do is to try to pass on knowledge, to carry on gaining knowledge, but to make sure that I'm passing on and training, the next generation. That's the most important thing I think I can do. I don't know if does that answer your question?
Yeah, same question to you, Jahawi.
I think a big part is demystifying the ocean. And in essence, we talked about, nutrients recycling and this and that and the other on land. And we all have a general concept of what that means on land, but it's the same thing underwater. And to understand that a lot of what we benefit from in terms of oxygen, carbon, sink, all of that is equally, if not more important, when we're talking about the oceans. So trying to understand our effects on the ocean is hugely important. And it has to be sort of disseminated in a way that is understandable in the same way that we're comfortable talking about it on land. And so I think that's a big step in terms of where we need to be going. And it's to finally realize just how important the oceans are, because life originated from the oceans. We're all products of the ocean. The oxygen we breathe comes from the ocean. It's very simple, but very powerful facts that we just need to, be sort of shouting, and everyone needs to understand it. And then, then it's easy to make informed decisions because, the gravity of the situation is understood. And yeah, the ocean should be demystified. And there's so much we don't know about the ocean, but there's so much that we don't know about how important it is for our life.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time for people like yourselves and everyone here to kind of really celebrate and amplify all the necessary narratives and the state of our ocean, and actually what we don't know, which is, to me, very exciting. We still don't know so much to do. Okay, I wanted to put this to you, Diva, if I can, as somebody who is a passionate conservationist. Maybe you may call yourself an eco-feminist, I'm not sure. But this is, what are your thoughts? This is a question that's come in. What are your thoughts on environment and climate change interlinking with other issues, such as feminism or racism? Ecofeminism seems to be an increasingly popular topic of conversation. What do you think?
Wow, that is certainly a question I have never, ever, ever been asked ever in the history of my career, but I love it. I think that the problem we face is that not enough people are involved and engaged in these issues and helping to push for better decisions and better policies. And that is as a result of various types of discrimination, whether it's racism or sexism or xenophobia, whatever it might be. But I think that, by trying to systematically dismantle some of those huge issues that will allow many more people to engage in issues like conservation rather than the sometimes more pressing issues which are just not being discriminated against. So I think they go hand in hand. It is, again, about engaging more of society, engaging in an inclusive and equitable way. Like, I cannot stress that enough. It's not just enough to be like, come in and then not treat people well. So really it is about dismantling these things, and that will really help to put us on the right path in order to begin to think about the world a little differently and put our actions and our efforts towards creating actions, I should say, that will help to better the planet. So I certainly think they're all linked.
Yeah, very linked, deeply linked, and huge issues around all of those. I mean, it's not a small question when we have just 5 minutes left, but thank you for tackling head on. Angela, this is a question that's come in. Where do you think we need more scientific research to understand and protect our oceans going forward?
I suppose I'd say everywhere. So to be honest, if you think about the fact that about 150 years ago, there was the first real expedition that was about oceanography. And at that point, we thought there was no life below 200 meters. And we thought that the bottom of the sea was flat because the surface of the ocean was. And since then, we have learned vast amounts, but we've only touched the surface. So I do think we need to understand a huge amount about, so in terms of biodiversity, we also need to understand what will help. So what difference do marine protected areas make? Can we regulate them well enough to ensure, can we make sure they're adapted to a climate change scenario so that we can see if that's actually affecting the way in which organisms are moving as part of climate change? So that's a really important area. The deep sea is so vastly unexplored, and there's so much more to be done in that area. But actually just even thinking about the way in which our ocean takes up heat and moves it and redistributes it, and that might be changing. So the way in which oceanography is actually redistributing heat and nutrients around the planet. And if we stop that conveyor of transport, then we could completely shift the entire system. So it's quite hard for me to pick a thing. What I think we need to do is continue to really start to keep that going. What I think we need to do, though, is start doing it slightly differently. So we've previously gone out, we've done a crew expedition, and we've taken samples and come back. But it's actually quite hard to do much oceanography in the vast ocean that way. So we're moving more towards new sensors, new technologies, ways of getting automatic observations that could come in real time and a data for everybody to use. And coming back to what was mentioned earlier, we need this to be freely accessible to everybody. And so the way in which we might research the ocean, that we need to think about how the infrastructure needs could be separated from the science needs as well. And so if we think about satellites, satellites are put up and the data coming off is used by everybody. Scientists don't have to pitch for a bit of a satellite. So I think we need to think about how we're observing the oceans, think about how we're modeling the oceans, think about the new technology we need and how data is going to be massively generated if we're really going to do it. So it's more than just the questions, it's the how do we tackle those questions that's kind of key.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you for answering that, Angela. We have really just a few minutes left. So if I may kind of put this question to all of our lovely panelists now, starting with you, Angela, are you hopeful? Do you think the challenges we face will change in the future?
Yes, I am hopeful. I'd like to think of myself as a pragmatic optimist, which is I can be optimistic, but you need pragmatic solutions in place to make the optimism come true. So yes, absolutely, I'm hopeful. I do believe that we can make a difference. Let's be honest, we already have made a difference, whether it's negative or positive. So if all the people on the planet can change it, they can change it another way as well. And if people start to become aware, and I see much more of an interest. I also have teenage kids, and I see the younger generation being far more engaged, excited by the environment, sustainability, equality, things that really matter. And so I feel very optimistic about the future. And I hope that I get to watch some really exciting discoveries over the next 30 years.
Yes, absolutely. A bit of outrage fueled by optimism. I love that. Richard, second on the list of the poll, reducing or not using single-use plastic products. That's one of the top things. What are you hopeful? Are you hopeful about changing the future of plastics in our ocean?
I'm very hopeful about that. I'm definitely an optimist, and at the heart of it is that particular challenge it isn't about us not using something. It's not about us turning the lights off or stopping taking a long haul flight. It's about using plastic more responsibly. So it's possible to get the benefits without these largely unintended consequences. So I'm very optimistic if we're all prepared to work together, right, the way from design, use and disposal. It's a problem we can solve. And if we could move beyond that, it would allow us to tackle some of the other issues, which are also incredibly pressing. The climate change that we've heard so much more about, that is probably much more challenging. If we can't fix plastic, that's kind of the answers I feel are staring us in the face. So yes, I'm very optimistic about that, but we can only tackle it if we all work together, industry, government, and citizens at large.
Thank you, Richard. Same to you, Diva.
Yeah, I just think, we're going to see the oceans just herald the most amazing discoveries in the future, discoveries that will blow our minds and capture our imaginations and also potentially provide solutions to some of the greatest challenges. But, really it is about us all working collectively towards preserving our oceans so that it can do that in the future.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Jahawi, are you an optimist?
I'll echo what everyone said. The oceans have such resilience to bounce back. And we need to all come together to give them that time to come back because they give us so much. And so it's a collective thing. It's us. It's us changing the way we see things. It's us understanding things. It's us pushing governments. It's companies deciding to actually make products that work. It's what everyone said. Everyone needs to work together and the oceans will bounce back. And we need to be positive about it because it can happen, but we all just need to come together and do it.
Brilliant, brilliant words to finish on. Thank you, Jahawi. And thank you all for your brilliant input today. I knew this was going to be a great panel, but I have to say thank you hugely to all of you who've been taking part, sending in your questions and voting on the polls on the Slido app. I think it's a really exciting way of getting you as part of the conversation, such an important conversation. So thank you to all my fantastic panelists for your wonderful contribution today. I'm sure everyone admires you. Go and follow all their work immediately if you don't already, and make sure you subscribe to the Royal Society YouTube channel for more content. Of course, this is the 8th event, is part of this You and the Planet series, so you can catch up on all the previous ones if you have missed them, but make sure you take a few minutes to complete the evaluation survey in the YouTube description. I hope you've all enjoyed. This has been an absolute pleasure. A massive thank you to Royal Society for putting this together, and we'll see you all very soon. Bye.